Okay. I go to the left.
Brownie says you get eaten by a bear.
Alright, fine. I'll go to the right.
And Brownie says you get eaten by a bear.
Fine. I'll turn around and go back to town.
You get ambushed and eaten by a bear.
Is there any possible decision that I could make that won't result in me getting ambushed and or eaten by a bear? This campaign is unbearable.
Yeah, you could say at this point it's barely a campaign.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Unqualified Experts. I'm your host, Braden Gardner.
I'm your corrupt overlord, Shane Dayton. And today, as you might have guessed, we are talking about how much should a player's decisions matter in a campaign. I'm guessing the answer is a little bit more than previously shown.
You think?
And, we've all had those campaigns where it can be a challenge. If you're a DM, you want to give your players plenty of agency. You want to give them the ability to explore the world. You want to avoid railroading, which everybody hates, and I particularly hate with a passion. But at the same time, if you give a little bit too much freedom, look, players derail the campaign. That's what they do. And that's fine. That is part of the gig of being a game master. But at the same time, you need to find that nice balance of respecting the decisions that your players make versus if I let them do this, I have to write a brand new campaign every single time there's a session. Because that's just not viable for most of us either. And I'm one of those where I'm a strong believer in agency for the players. I want to explore their ideas, especially with some of the crazy groups we have, because it's entertaining. But sometimes you need to direct them back onto the path somehow. And figuring out that balance is a really interesting discussion point for us.
Absolutely. I mean, like Shane mentioned, you don't want to have too many cooks in the kitchen. Collective storytelling is great. You want to make sure that the players feel that their decisions matter, because if they don't, they're not going to be invested.
Yeah, what's the point?
But by the same token, you don't want them to basically completely derail the overarching key plot points that are going on either, unless it makes sense for them to do so, and oftentimes it just isn't going to. So you'll want to kind of figure out which cases it's better to be a little more hands-on, and which ones it's better to be a little more hands-off.
Yeah, and right off the bat, we'll say, there is not a set in stone, God's finger on the mountain rule for when exactly you push them or railroad a little bit, or when you give complete agency. It depends on the group, it depends on the playing style, and as you DM more and more games, you'll get better at figuring this out. But a few guidelines along the way can really help out, because I have seen games that have been derailed because the DM just wouldn't let go. And so it just felt like unless you went along the straight line, it just didn't matter. And I'll admit, I'm on the other side. I tend to give a little bit too much player agency, which is how we go 6 months into a campaign without moving the plot point out of a one-mission town in the swamp.
I apologize for nothing. That town was a trap. We did not need to be there. We carved out our own town with blackjack
And
rust monsters, and it was a good
armor,
time.
That was something. I don't think they're ever going to forgive me for that campaign.
Not at all.
But I think with a few tips, you can get a pretty good balance of what to do. And one is try to figure out what you're good at. I would say between us, Braden is a better DM at having a clear A to Z plot and knowing how to encourage the players to get there. The decisions still matter, but the way things are framed up, we tend to keep moving things forward. Sometimes with an exasperated, how the hell did you guys do this much from Monday to Wednesday? Which was amazing. But it kept moving, just in a really weird way he wasn't expecting. I tend to be the other way where I am very, very good at improv. Like, I've wanted to be a fiction writer since I was 3. I've written stories all my life, so I am very good at just making stuff up off the top of my head, acting like it was planned all along, and acting like I had this amazing 6-month plan that just tied together in ways that seem inexplicable. That's never how it played out. I was just very good at bringing them together to make it look like I was a genius. I had no idea what I was doing half the time. But I can be a little bit more loose and free because I'm very strong doing the improv, giving the players that agency, letting them do the weird side quest or weird NPC. And so I'm a little bit more comfortable there. It also means I need to pay attention when I've let it go on too long. And knowing that makes my future campaigns more effective because, okay, I'm not in danger of not letting the players' decisions matter, but I am in danger of the plot goes this way or this way, and somehow they're out in the backyard across the street. And I need to, if I keep an eye on that, that's less likely to happen in the future.
Exactly. And here's the thing. Ultimately, a story is going to have a beginning, a destination you're building up to at the very end, and there are probably going to be a few key points somewhere along the way that the players are going to have to interact with in order to progress the story. So ultimately, you want to make sure that you're giving enough agency so that choices matter and they can choose their own route to get to those key points, to get to the next step in the story, basically. And if that involves creating a few extra side quests, things that don't strictly matter for the overarching story that's trying to be created, then you can afford to give considerably more agency. But if your players are starting to make decisions that render the overarching plot largely irrelevant, then you're going to need to kind of take a step back and assess, are these decisions reasonable? How are the primary adversaries going to react to these changes? And what are they going to do to adapt to the situation? So you want to make sure that you're giving your players the options for how they want to address a situation, but you don't necessarily want to give them everything they want when choosing that path.
Well, and Jason Carl, who runs amazing games of Vampire on YouTube, if you've never seen him, has a great quote along that lines. Give the players exactly what they want, just not in the way or consequences they intended. Which is a good way of storytelling. And I do kind of think, you will get better with each campaign as you watch your players. Don't be afraid to take notes. Like, this is not to make us look fancy. It's to help out when we need to remember where we are. Especially if you have a large group. Like, in my group, okay, Braden, Gallo, they will pay attention to details. So I look at their background. I look at the little skills and specialties they might have. Give them their day in the sun by making one of those actually matter. The sorcerer who can find any answer in a library, well now, since he knows that matters every time in my campaign, I know he's going to look for a library. So if I get off track, all I have to do is set up something in the city where, hey, this piece of information in the library sends him off back onto the plot. And that's a way where his choices can matter along the way. Because I know at some point, Town B hit the library, Town D hit the library. I have that ability to correct, to persuade, or to get them the information they need.
And it's not just good for making sure that the players are getting a choice overall, it's good for making sure that the choices they made when designing their characters and even their backstories and overarching story in the campaign matters.
Yeah.
This is a great way to give them the agency to make decisions and then potentially be rewarded or punished depending on the choices that they made. This is a great place to offer a higher than average amount of agency.
Yeah, and the nice thing about that is their decisions do matter. Because you know they're going from point A to point B to point C, but they get to choose how to get there. And that, for my skill set for improving as a DM, that is the best of both worlds. Because I know I can get them to a point where we can get back on track. Now, do they get there normally? Do they get there after meeting a mystical beast? Do they get there because Callahan rolls a 1 in 120 chance with the dice and messes with the machine they shouldn't have let them touch? You have options. As we were saying with notes on players, Callahan's my chaos guy. If I just need someone to screw stuff up, just give him the opportunity to cause mischief. He will take it.
Every time.
Yeah, I've seen Braden bait me into this. It's like, I know this is a bad decision, but we all know I'm stuffing my hand in that hole where, the shiny gold object is. And by knowing how your players react, some players, all you have to do is give them something to thwack. Great. Give your fighter a rival who keeps taunting him into the next territory or location. There are multiple ways to play into how your players build their character, and in this way, you're not railroading them, but you're giving them the opportunities to make decisions that they're in control of that still moves the story along. And it's a balancing act. Sometimes I do this really well, and sometimes not so much. But that's part of the fun, to be honest.
For sure. And when it comes to situations like that, the type of agency that you give your players also matters. Mm-hmm. You want to make sure that if your party isn't made up of players who are super good at picking up the subtle stuff, you're going to want to make sure that the choices that are laid out are fairly linear, with the option to reward if they think outside the box. Vice versa, if your party is made of players who are really good at picking up on the subtle stuff, make sure to weave in some subtle hints here and there as they're progressing through a situation to see if they pick up on a hint that you're trying to give them about something they might be able to do that they wouldn't necessarily think of at first glance.
Yeah, and I think the A-B option is a good way to do that. Okay, here's a subtle way to get to the next point. If they don't pick up on that, don't make them read you the same riddle for an hour. Give them a second option of, and maybe it's one they come up with. Like maybe you had idea 1, solve the riddle. Idea 2, notice a magical item. And then your barbarian might go, I'm tired, I'm raging, I am punching everything in sight. Cool, improv time. Huh, that statue broke apart, what's inside? Maybe the floor gives away. Maybe it's an enemy that gives you time to think as they are fighting the enemy. Because, let's face it, sometimes that random encounter is the perfect way to give yourself time to get everything back on track. It's not a bad tool.
Absolutely. And maybe they come up with something completely off the wall, something you don't necessarily know the answer to yourself when they do it. Maybe they come up with an option C that just completely goes in a separate direction from your A and your B. It's okay to take a moment to think about it or call a break to kind of decide how you want to handle it. You don't want to necessarily rule that out because you didn't think of it. Players are clever and have an uncanny ability to reduce the most orderly, well-planned session to elemental chaos within minutes of starting a session.
I mean, if you've been a player and a DM, you know for whatever reason, the dice gods give you plus 20 IQ when you're on the player side and you get to cause trouble. It just works out that way.
And you should embrace that. And great, they came up with this option. Maybe you take a couple minutes to kind of ponder and let the table kind of talk amongst themselves for a little bit and congratulate the antics of the player who has now given you this wonderful brain teaser to unravel. Not a big deal.
And one of my favorites. Okay, guys, I need to stretch for about 10 minutes, take a slight break, and we will get back to the problem you caused. And then you have 15 minutes to think of the problem they caused.
Totally okay for that to happen, and it allows you to kind of embrace agency and make the choice matter while giving you a way to structure it in a way that makes sense and allows things to progress.
And I would say that I'm a big fan of player agency. I think a good rule of thumb for when you put the hammer down a little bit more, is it hijinks or is it hijacking? If they're causing hijinks, great. That can be some of the best stories of any campaign. If they are hijacking, trying to hijack the plot from you, the story from you, cutting off other players to focus it all in a direction, that's just not cool table manners, period. And that's the point where, yes, you're allowed to put down the rule of the agency. Hopefully you had a very good session 0 where you set expectations. And if it's getting to the point where it's hijacking, call a break, talk to the player on the side, figure out where the miscommunication is. And hopefully it's not a bad faith issue. It very rarely is. And the few times it is, put your foot down. Because one person should not spoil the fun for 5 or 6 others. And I think that's only happened one time in my experience, like 5 years, but
It does come
if it happens, it happens.
And beyond that, though, interactions with other players are... I know that we've kind of progressed to less agency necessarily with key points, more agency with personal stories and builds. Interactions between players should be where, in my experience, you offer the most agency.
Yeah,
This
absolutely.
is the easiest part of a DM session. You basically have a player who's interacting with another player over whatever may have just happened, whether that's shining a laser light for the tabaxi, or whether there's a scuffle where they are coming to blows.
Framing the fighter for a crime he didn't commit.
Not that any of us would ever do that. Just, these are the points in the session where you as the DM can feel pretty good about kicking back and just loosely keeping an eye on what's going on, but you don't really have to do much more than that. Your players kind of have full agency until they reach the point where they cross the line and are hijacking.
And at that point, when the players are interacting, that's just a sign you've done a good job. You've created a world and a game where the players want to be in that world. They want to interact with each other as their characters. Let it ride. We have had hour or 2 hour sessions where the airship pirate is running around the town looking for the perfect tailor because he can't get the exact suit he wants. And it was hilarious. Just, I'll let him look for a tailor. Oh, he rolled a 3. Yup, this is the newest fashion of burlap sack. I'm going to another store. And sometimes the dice just bless you, and he just kept rolling 2s and 1s. And the whole table was perfectly fine with watching him fail one time after another, because he embraced it, laughed about the failure. At that point, it wasn't hijacking. The whole table thought it was hilarious. And
They were invested.
You kept running, yep.
And that's kind of where you have to kind of draw the line between hijinks and hijacking. If the table is invested in what a character or characters are doing, then it's more hijinks.
Yep.
If you see players playing on their phones, their laptops, having side conversations, you're starting to lose them, and it's starting to tread more into the realm of hijacking.
Yeah. Or, hey, I made a bunch of rolls, but I'm not telling anyone what they're about. You're the DM. You need to have an idea of what's going on because you approved the rolls. Like, that's not being too heavy-handed. That's being reasonable in that case. And so, those won't come up often, but once again, if it's your first campaign, you're going to screw up a little bit. You're going to railroad a little bit too much. At one point, you're going to give too much agency at another. Just learn from it. Like, no one expects you to be perfect as a DM. Even as an experienced one, I remember Braden's last campaign, there was a point where at the end of the session, 2 of us were like, hey, can we still play our players, or are we glorified NPCs at this point? And Braden was honest. He's like, I'm not sure. You guys made so many decisions. Give me a day to get back to you. And that's perfectly acceptable. It turns out we were able to play it out to the end, but the mess happened. It was a good time to stop, and at that point, it's like, the players had agency, they made decisions. There are consequences. But he had the respect for the players to figure out, okay, can you still play at this point, or am I railroading you along? Because he didn't want 2/3 of the table to be railroaded to an ending.
Exactly. And in that scenario, there were good cases to be made either way.
Yeah.
And I had to look at the scenario to see, okay, is this a scenario where it is even remotely reasonable to offer them the option of continuing to play their characters? If so, why? If not, why?
We screwed things up so badly.
Oh, man.
So quickly.
In true Dresden verse fashion, because this was for the Dresden Files RPG game that I ran a while back, and in that universe, everything is always just going to hell in a handbasket.
Bad, worse, worser, and more worse or awful.
Exactly. And the last thing that I would really say regarding the discussion of player agency is that the amount that is necessary to get the best flow for a game is going to vary from system to system and playgroup to playgroup.
Yup, absolutely. And I do think that's a very good point. When we did mine, it was a very open world D&D RPG. We knew it was open world. We knew it was going to be... Well, we thought it was going to be 2 years. It ended up being 4 years. But you know what? It was an open world, so that was acceptable. For you have 12 weeks to do this campaign in this Dresden universe, that was not nearly a viable option to get things done.
Exactly. And due to the players' decisions, I had planned for this campaign to take place over the course of weeks, and it took place over the course of 6 days.
Yeah. One of which was spent with all of us recovering.
Yeah, that was including their rest day, which was not as restful as they might have liked.
We're talented. But just as a last thing, so we definitely want to hear what you think. Do you have any stories? Do you have tips for the DMs who railroad too much? Do you have tips for the DMs who tend to go a little bit too loose? We'd love to hear about in the comments. And, oh wait, what's that, Brownie? He says you need to roll a charisma check.
Oh, goody.
He says the bears like you and invite you to a dinner of Goldilocks. I'd accept. I think you're getting eaten if you don't.
A choice. I'm shocked.
He's learning. That's it for us, guys. As always, have fun and good gaming.
See you next time.
If you like what you just saw, please support us by hitting that like button and subscribing to our channel for more great gaming content.